Today I am joined with Dr. Sandra Glahn. She's author and professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
My first question, I'd like to know if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit of your background and what led you to where you are today, where your
Where I
work
am
has brought
today.
you, your
Well, I
studies.
certainly never set out to be a female seminary professor. In fact, ironically, when my husband was in seminary, I didn't think such a thing should exist. I didn't even think women should go to seminary, let alone teach at one. But, life has a way of making you relook at the scriptures when your paradigm doesn't quite fit reality. And in our case, I'm the fourth of five kids. I loved having a fabulous mother. I wanted to be a mom, and that was the only vocation I really aspired to. But we hit the brick wall of infertility and pregnancy loss that spanned a decade for us. We had 3 years of no success, then we had seven early pregnancy losses, and then we had three adoptions fall through. And for me, all of that would have certainly been a marital, emotional, psychological, ethical, medical, financial crisis. But for me,
Yeah.
the biggest crisis was a crisis of identity because I had only one vision for what a godly, someone who aspires to be godly in a female body is supposed to do, and that was motherhood with many kids. And I look back on that now and think how cruel to widows and people who are single. God's pattern book clearly is bigger than that. But also I wanted to value the family. And so I realized I needed to relook at where did I get this idea that this is the ideal? Um, and it was not just my personal journey, but also I had become I was a new Christian around age 14, and plugged into a pretty fundamentalist church apart from my parents. They were in a mainline denomination, and I had never trusted Christ. And then when I was 14, I did, but it was a pretty conservative. It was ultra conservative. Like, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Shiny Happy People, but it
Oh, I haven't.
it was very much along the lines of there is one role for women and this is it.
Okay.
And so, but fortunately, my high school sweetheart, whom I married, um, he did not hold those same views. So when I began exploring who am I and what can I do, he was saying, "You go, girl. You have teaching gifts. The body of Christ could benefit from them. You don't have to sit and vacuum. Like there are
Yeah.
other things that are worthy work that you can do. Go for it." And also my pastor, so he was in one ear and my pastor's
Right.
wife in the other ear going, I could use your help on women's Bible study.
Okay.
So as then we did some international travel with missions, and I discovered just how much of my thinking was influenced by being in the southern United States, which is
Okay.
very much, southern girl, a little bit patriarchal in a benevolent kind of way, but nevertheless not really applauding women for their gifts. So all of that drove me back to the text. And it was a long, has been a long journey of trying to sort through how much did I pick up cultural baggage, how much of this is from the Christian bubble, and how much is this of this is really biblical. And if something is biblical, it has to be transcultural, right? It's
Right.
it's got to work in remote, Kenya, as well as it
Yes.
works in urban Dallas. So that's
Yes.
how sort of how, you know, believe it or not, the short version I
Okay.
got here.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so that's quite a journey, and I'm sure
Yeah,
it was very heartbreaking at
yeah,
times
yeah.
for your identity, especially if you feel led to teach or that you have the a gift from the Holy Spirit, and then to feel like maybe that's a very confusing
So
method.
yes, my understanding of First Timothy and how I had been taught First Timothy when it talks about she will be saved through childbearing, I was really taught that that referred to the nuclear family and that a woman can't teach, but that she's supposed to channel all those desires to train the next generation in her nuclear family. And again, then you get to Kenya. Literally, we went to Kenya and like
Okay.
the nuclear family doesn't even exist here, right? It's the extended family. And then I started thinking, well, that's what it would have been in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, all of those thoughts of
Okay.
how did we get here? And, long story short, I ended up in seminary revisiting all of that. Just as an example, I looked at the story of Martha and Mary, and Martha's in the kitchen. And
Hmm.
Mary's the seminary student, if you will. And
Right.
Jesus is saying, Mary's chosen what is better. And again, there's nothing wrong with the kitchen, it's just priorities. And I'm like,
Right.
okay, so Jesus is the first rabbi I know of to have a
Yeah.
disciple. And so I ended up in seminary. I had no idea where it was going to lead me, but those doors kept opening. So the doors to motherhood kept slamming shut. Try
Right.
as we did, but the doors to ministry in other ways kept opening.
Okay. Yeah, and the Mary and Martha, that's I found that was a very beautiful story. It's very touching that
Mhm.
that you shared in the book there. And
So nobody's mother,
Nobody's Mother.
nobody's
Yeah.
mother. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
great book. Um,
You-
and yeah, I'm going to have some links for the book and anything else that you'd like to have linked to an Amazon
Great,
page perhaps or something
great,
like that in the description.
great. Thanks.
All right, perfect. So then that sent you on the journey to seek out this, try to separate this context of
Right.
cultural, what's my cultural baggage and what is the text actually saying?
Yes,
And that's,
exactly.
yeah, and I think we all kind of are trying to unravel those.
Yeah, as well we should, right? As well we should. So we know that if Paul says, come before winter, that's not spoken to everybody. It's for
Yes,
everybody, but it's not to everybody.
right.
That one's easy. It gets a
Yes,
little harder when you say greet one another with a holy kiss. In the West, we don't do that, but there are
right.
parts of the world where they're like, but it's like in there 4 or 5 or 6 times, like so. Must be done literally. Wash one another's feet. And so the
Yes,
first thing I really had to do was explore how do you know? What are some of the markers in the text? One marker is who's the audience? Is it a letter to Timothy that benefits all of us, but is it a letter with the second person you is in singular, right? Rather than to the whole
right.
church, y'all, as we
Okay.
would say here in the South.
Okay.
Um, and so that's one of the questions that I had to explore. But really, I went to seminary to answer the question about who am I? What was woman made for? What am I here for? Not really thinking I would teach. I just had to know for myself. I was ready to obey. I just had to know what the parameters were
Yeah.
because it came down to if you sense God has given you teaching gifts, and you have an opportunity, is it you go girl or you're being a pushy broad, back off. And I just needed to know what the parameters were. Little did I know that that would lead to a broader ministry because lots of people are asking these same questions. But initially, it was really for me and my own identity to figure out what does the text
Okay.
say?
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. I had a question when you were talking about the letter, deciding or trying to find out, is it to all of us now? Is it to an individual? Like, say you're talking about Timothy and you were looking at then some of the grammar.
Right.
So do you have you come to the conclusion, did Paul expect, do you think, a wider audience as well? Like maybe for ministers, so to.
Certainly, and everything that has an individual, maybe an imperative, that doesn't mean the church can't benefit from it. The challenge is we need to not make it necessarily a one-to-one parallel, that a parallel that an imperative to him is an imperative to us. For example, I think when Paul gives instructions to Timothy about he starts that letter by saying, I left you in Ephesus, so we know he's in Ephesus, to teach certain people not to teach false doctrine. So then we ask, well, do we have any hints as to what that false doctrine is? Well, there are some hints in First Timothy, but there's a massive section of the book of Acts that talks about Ephesus and Paul's experience there. And the first part of the story is the magic workers are coming to Christ left and right, and they finally had to have a big book burning where thousands of dollars, maybe an occult would be a better translation because we might think of pulling a rabbit out of a hat for magic, but
Okay.
it's the dark sciences, right? And Jesus is stronger, and he's proving himself stronger to the point where even if Paul touches a cloak or a handkerchief and somebody else touches it, they're healed. That doesn't mean that's for all time. Just because that narrative reports that, it means, but it does say if you go into a new culture that's never heard the gospel, don't be surprised if miracles happen that are directly relating to their stronghold.
Okay.
Um, I
Wow.
suspect if that were to happen in America today, it might be a massive crypto takeover. I don't know. I mean, it would probably relate to money
Okay.
that would prove the billionaires that Jesus is richer. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway, what are the strongholds in a culture? And Jesus is stronger. And the other half of that section of Acts 19 talks about how people come from all over the empire to worship Artemis. Her temple is one of the seven wonders of the world. And she the workers that are making sort of souvenir trinkets are angry because the gospel work is so successful. It's cutting into their financial to their trade.
Right.
And so I think it's entire so they're chanting great is Artemis of the Ephesians for 2 hours. It's Artemis related. So you ask who's Artemis at the time of the earliest Christians, and finding out that she is a goddess of midwifery, among other things, could influence how we read a woman. She will be saved through childbearing. Because if
Right.
their God is childbearing God, then Jesus is stronger. You might expect that women are going to survive childbirth, but that doesn't mean for all time in every place. So what's beneficial for the church in that? Well, Jesus is superior, period. That I
Hmm.
mean that's applicable to all of us today, right? But
Yes.
also then what's a great ministry approach? Go after the strongholds and show that Jesus is stronger and you're going to have to depend on him to prove himself as God. That doesn't mean we put him to the test. It means he shows up and demonstrates. So you ask, how do we sort through that? Can you hear how like that's for the church today, but it's
Yes.
not necessarily a one-on-one. We don't say all women will be saved through childbearing,
Right.
right?
Right. Yes, that makes sense. And that that context, I guess, the further away we are, the
Yeah,
harder to see. Whereas what
yeah,
wouldn't have thought to the original author or audience
correct,
to even
correct.
clarify these
Yes,
things that are just
yeah.
obvious as we go further through 2000 years, we've ended up in a whole different situation. And
Absolutely. If my husband and I talk about a phone booth, our daughter has no clue what we're talking about, and she's not that far removed. They're just
right,
things that we can assume without even having to explain them in our culture, that as things change. So the further you get from the letter, from the work, the more you need some cultural context. But a lot of times the scripture itself provides it. We have a lot of information about Ephesus in the first century, thanks to Luke recording it in the book of Acts.
yes, perfect. Yeah, that's great. And did you find in your studies that were people looking to Acts, say, to clarify Ephesians? Was this
They
a
were not.
common?
They were
So
not, which is
interesting.
puzzling to me. It's really
Hmm.
puzzling to me. But I will say this, I am not primarily a New Testament scholar. My PhD was in the humanities, but with an eye on Artemis history, backgrounds, archaeology. My master's is in theology. But
Okay.
I even recently I heard a message in the book of First Thessalonians, and we didn't go back to Acts to learn what happened in Thessalonica, which is that Paul was there for 3 Sabbaths, and then there's this kind of a dangerous some violence that takes place, and they have to leave, and so that explains when Paul says we're concerned about you. We had to send Timothy back to find out how you were, and we were thrilled because they
Mhm.
only knew them for 2 weeks, but they grew to dearly love them. Well,
Right.
you can read First and Second Thessalonians and benefit from the book, but it really helps to know what story Paul's referring to. And again, you could say we're 2,000 years later, but also Luke recorded it in Acts to give us the
Yes.
backdrop for
Yes.
this story.
Yes. And he was a traveling companion of
He
Paul at
was.
times, right? So that's a good
Yeah.
source.
It is. He's an eyewitness. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're currently reading through, like at home here, um, Acts, and we tried to match
Mm.
up some of Paul's letters
Good for
in
you. Good for
sequence. So
you.
we're trying to follow the narrative of Acts with the letters. So
They really inform each other, right? And
yes.
so here is why I think this happens. There has been a problem in the past when we've gone to teach a book like First Thessalonians or First Timothy, where we've gone all over the Bible anytime there's a word we find that appeared somewhere else. And that's not a way to read literature, right? We just wouldn't do that with any other work of writing. And so we've gone the other extreme in saying, I'm only going to look at this. I'm only going to look in First Peter and not look within the fairly near context that would actually inform that situation. So, we like to swing pendulums back and forth. We need to be a little more in the middle that, as you're saying, as you're reading through Acts, look at the epistles that are written around this time and vice versa. If you're going through the epistles, see if there's a recording in Acts of what happened in that city.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea.
It doesn't seem that difficult, right? Yeah.
And then on top of that, just our current time frame with archaeology and what has become available to us all really through archaeology and the studies of the
Right.
last, I guess, 200 years.
Yeah.
Um, we've, I believe they've uncovered quite a bit of Ephesus.
Quite. You actually only like 20% on 150 years, but
Oh,
enough for us to
wow.
see. We have so many inscriptions that would inform our understanding of the New Testament. I had a expert in inscriptions tell me we have 500,000 to 1,000,000 that we haven't even incorporated into the dictionaries we create based on usage we've found. And the beauty of the inscriptions in the Roman Empire, they loved inscriptions for one thing, but it's very difficult to chisel them and change them. You can
Right.
change a manuscript and play around with it. Much more difficult to do that with stone. And so we find things like a lot of it's validating the faith. For example, Paul talks about in Ephesus how they had to move from the synagogue to the Hall of Tyrannus. Well, we haven't found the Hall of Tyrannus, but we have found that last name, if you will, in some of the inscriptions. So it's not that archaeology is driving scripture, it's that
Mhm.
archaeology is validating what the scriptures are telling us. Do we find massive references to Artemis in Ephesus? Yes. We find a huge temple. We find trinkets. We find inscriptions. We also find about 100 variations on her name where people, there's even one, in the pastorals where somebody is named Artemis, spelled with an ES instead of IS. It's his name. He's a
Okay.
co-worker with Paul, right? Parents are naming their kids, male and female, after the goddess. Well, that helps answer some of the questions. Is she for women only? No, I think of her a little more like the Virgin Mary, except the Virgin Mary's real. But men and
Okay.
women love Mary, right? It's not just because she's female, she's for women, right? And the same would have been true of Artemis followers.
Okay. Um, and how important, say, would Artemis be in the other regions? Would this, or would Ephesus be especially important?
Yeah.
And
Ephesus is to Artemis like Bethlehem is to Jesus. Only again, Jesus is God and she's not. But the
okay,
city had huge pride, not just pride because it was said that she was born there, but also because people are coming from all over to the magnificent temple. And in this world, there's no such thing as a central bank with security. And so if you're filthy rich somewhere else, you're going to travel to Ephesus to keep your money on deposit. Otherwise, there's danger of theft. So it has this huge influence around. So it's known all over the empire. But the other thing is, I have the I have seen statues of Artemis of the Ephesians in Jordan. I've seen statues from the first century of her, hundreds of miles, 700 miles away. So she was known. And we have a geographer from the second century, Pausanias, who walks all around the empire and records what he's seeing. And when the catalogers recently went to make an index of all the people he had mentioned that he'd seen, Artemis was second only to Zeus all over the empire in terms of the frequency at which he saw her. So that's helpful for Westerners because we don't think of her as number two. We might think of Zeus as one, but we're probably going to think of Achilles or like all kind of Mars. Uh, but in terms of what Pausanias saw in approximately our era, all over the empire, she is second only to Zeus in how often she is
okay.
named.
So that's pretty
It's
important.
pretty important.
Okay, and s- is Diana another name of Artemis?
Yes. So Artemis is the Greek name, and it's the name that actually appears in Acts. So the
Okay.
King James translates it as Diana because people tend to translate that, which is why for a long time I didn't connect the two. because I wasn't thinking of Artemis in Ephesus. I knew some things about Artemis, but I hadn't connected it with the story in Acts 19. So,
Okay.
yeah, so what you have is Greek and Latin both appearing. We find both inscriptions to Artemis of the Ephesians and Diana of Ephesus in the
Okay.
same city. The other
Okay.
thing you see in the same city is the Artemis of the Ephesians has these bulbous appendages all over her. She's pretty strange looking. Whereas
Hmm.
Diana is much more like Wonder Woman, got a short skirt, bow and arrow. It's the same goddess. It's just a
Okay.
different manifestation of her.
Okay. So with Diana, then you said looking like Wonder Woman,
Yeah.
and Wonder Woman's name is Diana.
Yeah. She's absolutely based on Artemis.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And the author of Wonder Woman are
Absolutely.
definitely
Is
okay.
going on this. What he gets wrong though is that, well, he's just looking at Diana. I liken it to stereotypical Barbie and say maybe RV Barbie. Okay, they're both the same Mattel, but they
Okay.
might have different colored skin and hair and even different careers. And you're like, how can this be the same woman? I don't know. She just does. And
Okay.
so they are the same goddess with the same backstory, and yet they have very different manifestations.
Okay.
And you
Interesting.
have both of those Diana, Artemis in the temple, in statues in Ephesus,
In the same place.
in the same place. They're not competing images, they're just complementary images. Again, if I want to go to the Virgin Mary, I liken it a little bit to the manifestation of the Virgin of Guatemala. Um, and again, she's Mary, but she's very localized. She's wearing local clothes. She has her own local sort of myth.
Hmm.
But it's still Mary, the mother of Jesus. Or
Right.
maybe easier for this audience is if you go to Nazareth, to the church of, I think it's the Church of the Nativity. Yeah, it is the Church of the Nativity there. They asked for people from all over the world to send a depiction of Mary and Jesus. So the Puerto Rican Mary and Jesus is Latino. And
Okay.
actually, the American one is like Metallica. Um,
Okay.
but they're all the same story, but very different local flavors in how they're portrayed.
And I guess even in the ancient times, it's geographical to the people that are approaching. Is that the idea that or is that more
Hmm, that's
our
a good
culture?
question. I think there is a geographical link in that the temple to Artemis that's standing at the time of Paul is the second temple. The first one burned down, and the local story is, well, Artemis is a midwife, and she was off delivering Alexander the Great in the fourth century
Yeah,
BC.
I was in.
And and because gods and goddesses in the pantheon are not omnipresent, but geographical. They're limited
Okay.
by geography. She couldn't be there to protect her temple. She had to make a choice. He was more important than her structure. I mean, that's
Okay.
how the story gets told. And that's part of how we know she was, even in the time of Paul, considered a midwife, because this is the story they're telling. They're repeating from, centuries earlier, but they're still holding to it.
Okay. And then, so you're convinced that Paul was definitely had Artemis in mind when he was talking
I am.
to.
I really am. So here's part of why, and it's not just that he borrows the phrase, "She will be saved through childbearing," and then he change. So in the Greek, it's she. A lot of our translations say they because the next line is if they continue in the faith, and we're trying to reconcile a singular and a plural. But more literally, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in the faith. This is a faithful saying. I think he's saying she'll be saved through childbearing. He's borrowing a local saying and then putting his Christian spin on it, which Paul loves to do, and then
Mhm.
saying, this is a faithful saying. He's turned it into a faithful saying. The very next line is, if somebody desires to be an elder, they aspire to be a good thing. So it's a new paragraph, new topic. We have tended to put the phrase, this is a faithful saying, with that statement, if anybody aspires to be an elder, rather
Okay.
than what came before it. But as you well know, the numberings, the paragraphings didn't come till about 200 years ago, maybe 500 years
Right.
ago, depending, right? And so it was a judgment call. It was an interpretive call. Where is this is the saying? Which part does that go to? And
Right.
Paul sometimes puts it with what preceded and sometimes what comes after. But something we do know about all his faithful sayings is they have either the word save or the idea of salvation somewhere in them,
Okay.
except the reference to elders, which would be the one exception. which,
Okay.
right, to me, that says he's picking a local saying.
Okay.
Something else that's really essential, and this goes back to our conversation earlier about Jesus being superior. When Paul opens a letter to someone, he usually begins with something like grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. When
Hmm.
he begins First Timothy, he pulls out like four different titles of God that all the inscriptions are assigning to Artemis, including
Okay.
Savior. Now, you and I we very commonly hear Jesus as Savior. That's just a very common part of our language. But
Yeah.
that was not a common part of Paul. We only find him using that in either letter to the Ephesians, who are in Ephesus, in the pastoral epistles. And so Titus is in Crete, and it shows up in the book of Titus. Crete
Okay.
also has a huge Artemis temple and following.
All right.
And I found lots of inscriptions to it's soteria is the word in Greek to Artemis soteria. And
Okay.
I think what Paul is doing is saying, God, our Father, Lord, Christ, Savior, I left you in Ephesus to teach certain people not to teach false doctrine. And Timothy would have totally known what he's doing. It's like saying the word kryptonite and asking which superhero do you think I have in mind? And
Right.
some people have asked me, why do you think Paul didn't say Artemis's name? Well, you'll never see Paul say the name of a god, ever.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I had
Yeah.
never noticed that.
Yeah. In fact, when people are talking about Paul, what do they say? Well, he hasn't blasphemed the goddess. And you just doing, I did a trace last week to just look at what does Paul actually say, and what he says is God. He calls them gods made with hands, who are not gods at all. It's like, why would I even call a stone a god? Please, it's
Right.
just a rock, right?
Right.
Whereas Luke has probably got a Greek background and maybe a Gentile background, and he doesn't hesitate to say, "Hey, they thought he was Hermes over
Yeah.
in Acts," and you
Yeah.
just will not see Paul doing that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, that
Yeah.
contrast that because not to have a false god on your lips, right, from the Torah. So that's interesting.
Yeah. He clearly doesn't enforce it with Luke, so maybe he's like it's a personal conviction, but you
Yeah.
just don't see Paul doing that. In fact, I was looking in the New Testament to see is there anybody else who utters the name of a god? And you have Jesus talking about Beelzebub, but
Yeah,
then I
that
realized as I was stewing on that, I thought, okay, yeah, but he's referring to Satan who is real. Satan is real. He's just weaker than Jesus. But
right.
when Paul's talking about the pantheon, he's talking about stones, rocks, statues that people made.
Okay.
Yeah,
And one thing I was going to say, when you said Paul was likely taking a local quote and repurposing it,
yeah,
like a polemic,
yeah.
that appears to be a common thing in the Bible, even
It
Old and
does.
New Testament, to redirect or take imagery
Yeah,
and away
yeah,
from, say, the pagan and
yeah.
apply it. Is that fair?
It is really fair. And it would be very much like me looking at Christians eating each other up and saying, why you got to be so mean? Okay, yes, I'm quoting Taylor Swift, but I'm applying it to something biblical, which is don't treat each other that way. And I don't have to say, I'm quoting Taylor because
Yeah,
everybody in my world knows. In fact, it might even insult them a little if
right.
I assume they had no idea what I was talking about. Even if they didn't know what I was talking about, they might not appreciate me insulting them by assuming they didn't know.
So that connects to it being more of an underlying cultural commonality that they're taking part in because they are
Yeah,
part of that world. So
yeah.
it's just kind of it's taken for granted that they all know whose roles are what or what titles go where, and so to say no, the God of Israel is the true
Right.
God, the Savior.
Well, and in fact, again, this letter is written to Timothy. That doesn't mean it doesn't benefit us. But Paul is definitely going to assume the protege, who he has spent more than 2 years with in Ephesus, doesn't need him to use papyrus, right? Burning up explanations for things that Timothy clearly knows. And it's on Timothy then to pass on the information. But I think Paul was writing that letter with the church in mind. I don't think he was writing it uh, to us. He was writing it for us, but he was writing it to Timothy.
Okay. And so Ephesus was an important place in the Roman Empire. So, and
Yeah.
him stationing, did he station Timothy there? Was Timothy from there?
No, Timothy was not from there, but he had some pals there. Paul liked to do his gospel work in a team, which again, these are the kinds of things we can take from what we're reading that aren't necessarily commanded, but we can benefit from. Paul's strategy when he goes into a new city is to go straight to the synagogue and preach the good news to his own people.
Hmm.
And eventually he'll get kicked out a lot of times, and then they go somewhere else. But Ephesus is his longest stay, and it's really a long stay. Now we see him taking some trips away when Apollos gets corrected by Aquila and Priscilla. Paul's out of town, excuse me, and Apollos is in Ephesus at the time. But if you think about the most strategic ports in the world, and I'm in America, so I'm thinking New York Harbor. I'm thinking if Paul wanted the most strategic ministry for shipping the gospel all over the world, he's not going to be in Washington, D.C. at the seat of power. He's going to be in New York, where you have the most international group of highly educated, highly mobile people. And he's going to be preaching the gospel there and discipling people there because they're going to go home to Hong Kong and Singapore and, name your country. Now, you could argue something similar for, going to Embassy Row. It's just that Ephesus is a port city. It's a massive port city. The ports keep silting up, so they keep having to dig out new ones. But Ephesus gets its empire status and its wealth. It's actually the richest city in the empire
Okay.
because it's commerce. And it's the capital of the province, which is called Asia, which is confusing to us now because we think of Asia as, like maybe Southeast Asia. But the name of the province is Asia, and Ephesus is the capital.
Okay. And so with your studies, you must have come to the conclusion that women can teach, as here you are
Yeah,
teaching.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. But it doesn't all depend on First Timothy. I mean,
I was going
uh,
to ask about Corinthians. Is
yeah,
that where we find suffer what he suffers not a woman to teach or to
yeah.
usurp the
So that's First Timothy,
oh that
which with
also.
yeah. So Corinthians, there are two different passages. In 1 Corinthians 11, he's talking about head coverings,
Okay.
but he's assuming women are going to pray and prophesy. The
Oh,
question is not, are women going to speak on behalf of God in the gathered assembly? The question is how they're going to do it. And we can argue all day, and we need backgrounds to help us. And everybody's drawing on backgrounds to try to figure out because, excuse me, the word veil doesn't actually appear in the text. And he says hair is a covering, and they did pile their hair on. So that's a whole other issue. But anyway, Paul assumes women are going to be speaking because they're given the gift of prophesying in that context. 3 chapters later, he says, let the women keep silent in the church for,
okay.
if they want to know, let them ask their husbands at home. Um, and so, two things you look at there. First of all, only 3 chapters earlier, he's assuming they won't keep silent in the church. So, by silence, there, he must not mean absolute silence.
Okay.
The other question we have there is a woman with a husband at home is called a wife. And there's not a separate Greek word for woman or wife. You have to figure it out from context. And a good case could be made that Paul's concern is with wives who are judging their husband's prophecies because the word therefore ask isn't just the kind of question like you're asking me questions. It's not that same word. It's more like
Okay.
vet or grill. When people
Hmm.
ask Jesus questions, it's used in a context with, not very friendly necessarily.
Right.
So, and that would fit with if wives are vetting their husband's prophecies, asking for validation in front of everyone, awkward. You might
Yeah.
want to do that vetting at home.
Yes.
And something
Yes.
similar happens in First Timothy. Is it let I am not permitting a woman or wife to speak or exercise authority over a husband. She'll be saved through childbearing. Like a woman who's having a baby in Paul's world is a wife. And
Yes.
so, a big question on those passages, why have we translated this with the most universal meaning when there are markers in the text that suggest maybe we should be limiting that to the marriage context? and Paul's concern for what is happening to these marriages in public.
Okay.
But to your question, we're not just basing my conclusions that women can teach on 1 Timothy 2. Paul's teaching needs to be paired with Paul's practice. And this is where Romans 16 has been very neglected.
Okay.
He's mentioning lots of women in this passage, and he's calling them co-workers. And he calls Phoebe not just a deacon, but a deacon at the church of Cenchrea. Like, he names the church, which is why even a lot of conservatives have said, yeah, I think she's really a deacon because she's a deacon of a specific church. He doesn't
Okay.
just call her a servant, right? You have Junia. Is she an apostle? Junianus, Andronica, sorry, Andronica and Junia are known among the apostles. Um,
Okay.
some have changed Junia's name to Junianus and made it male, but that
Oh,
is a little.
interesting.
The name has never been found. We found Junia all over the empire. We've never found a male version of that name.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
All right. So you have a deacon and you have apostles, you have prophesying all both men and women.
yeah,
So where do you think, so that's in New Testament times, that's
right,
in Paul's congregations, we'll say.
right.
Is where does it change quickly after that, or is it another culture that inherits the like the from the
Yeah,
Greco-Roman world more, or where do we start to see that
great
slide?
question. And this is where Protestants have a little bit of gap in our understanding because we don't have nuns. And so it never occurs to us to ask, when did nuns start? Where did they come from?
Okay.
And they're
Hmm.
going to root that in 1 Timothy 5, which we read widows and only read that as somebody who's hungry and needing a handout. But we don't look at, okay, but Paul is telling the young widows to marry, but he's saying if a widow is put on the rolls and takes an oath, she's breaking it if she gets married. Like, why? Well, it's because she's taking an oath to serve the church for life. And that's how it was understood. And in fact, the early church, uh, they're concerned, if they swung the pendulum too far, it was too far towards celibacy. And this is part of why when the reformers came in, they emptied the nunneries and the monasteries and just married the monks and the nuns to each other.
Okay.
And then we went too far in the other extreme and made the family almost a god. And there's almost no room in our church for people who are celibate and dedicated to that kind of service. So, what I think Paul is doing in First Timothy when he's starting to lay out the offices is he has a family is his metaphor. And you have elders are the dads, deacons are the brothers, deaconesses are the sisters, or female deacons are the sisters. And why are we not asking where are the mothers? Who are the mothers? Well, the mothers have the office of widow, but we don't hear that as an office, and so we assume it's a marital status. And
Okay.
we have found some tombstones where you have widows of the church of buried together, and we didn't notice because we were thinking, okay, until we saw widow to Silas, widow to, pick your first century name. It's like if you're widowed, your husband is named. So if you're a widow of the church, what does that say?
Hmm.
So you have the early church has women who are desert mothers, but we almost never hear of them. They would call that a win. Their goal was to be anonymous, unknown, people of prayer, not looking to have numbers on their social media. They're just, serving the poor, the destitute. And so you have the office of widow, and by the third century, it is morphed with the office of deaconess. And we really aren't seeing much on the office of deaconess until the third century. So we've wrongly assumed, oh, so women's ministry popped up for the first time in the third century because we just haven't found that much evidence of these holy women living in private. But we have more women working on PhDs now doing the research, so we're starting to uncover it. But I'll say this, that infant baptism was a big turning point in the diminishment of women's ministries. in the ministry of women and ministry leadership. Because before that time, you have women baptizing women. You don't have men touching a female body in public. Um,
Okay.
and you have women catechizing the women. I think in Titus, when he talks about the older women teaching the younger women what is good, he's not just meaning how to be husband loving, children loving people. What is good is the whole corpus of teaching, and they're
Hmm.
catechizing women, they're baptizing women, and you don't need that anymore if you're doing infant baptism. So that is part of it. The other thing that happens is architecture comes along after Constantine, and we start organizing the church more like well, it's interesting that we choose the word basilica, which was their word for like the law.
Okay.
And we adopted it. So if you go to Hagia Sophia, or it looks like Hagia Sophia when you spell it, huge church in Istanbul today. And it's an ancient church, but you'll go back many centuries and you'll see that there's a women's court that looks down on the men at worship. And they're segregated on a different floor, just observing. So some of the architecture, you get a pulpit and you take it out of a living room, and suddenly the church is less like your living room group where somebody brings a word and a lot more like somebody getting up and giving a speech behind something, and you can't get behind the thing if you're not
Hmm.
ordained. And then you got the whole history of ordination, which is not the same through the centuries. But we have found a fifth century ordination prayer to the office of widow.
Okay. And a couple of things like, so widow may not be in our vernacular, if that's the right word,
Yeah, exactly.
the right word to describe what we're reading about. Is that
Well, it is and it isn't. So here's what I think Paul is doing with Timothy in Ephesus. He's looking at the fact that Ephesus has so many single women in the church. And he's like, I think I have a solution here. Break them into three groups. Younger widows, they need to get married. And that doesn't mean they need to go find romantic partners. It means call in the matchmaker and find a match, right?
right?
The second group is widows who could be taken care of by their own kids and grandkids. Let's let them support them and feed them so that the church doesn't have to. And that third group is those who will be left alone, and we're going to give them a job. They're going to go on the rolls, they're going to get fed. They need to meet certain qualifications that are very interestingly similar to those of elders. Say a lot about the husband and one wife. We say almost nothing about the wife of one, having been the wife of one husband.
Hmm.
And then it says, having raised children. And we read that as she had to have had kids. But I think how they would have understood it was there were a lot of foundling girls, especially because they exposed their children if they didn't want to own them. And the
Wow. Yeah.
church is coming along. This is part of why there's so many females in the early church, because the church is pro-life. And
Okay.
so these widows are raising these children, and you'll see them sometimes. It's recorded where the widows and children will come bring food to prisoners. Not necessarily, again, their own children that they're bringing. So there's
I've
stuff in Timothy that we're just not seeing it.
right. With that exposure, I had heard too that maybe Rome or the Romans derogatorily would speak of the Christians as a religion of women and slaves. Was
Bingo, bingo. There you go. Because it was actually.
that's
Uh,
interesting to
It's
think of it that
because,
way.
and we were at our best. We were at our best, honestly, when Christianity was illegal. I'm not saying we should go back to that, but what was happening was, and here's a wrong narrative. It's a wrong narrative to say women are coming to Christianity in droves because Judaism treated them so badly. Like, you don't have to throw Judaism under the bus to exalt Christianity. That's not what's happening. But it
Hmm.
is true that they are caring about people who are hungry. They are caring for slaves. They're caring for the poor. And it's bizarre that they're doing that. Why would they do that? Well,
Hmm.
because they're members of a different kingdom. So yeah, it devalued them in the honor of the state in many ways. But we served one who was dishonored and took on the form of a slave.
Yeah. And I think crucifixion wasn't it very common for
Oh my goodness.
slaves and
Yeah.
insurrectionists? Was that was
And not only that, it was really an insult to your manhood. Like Jesus sacrificed his man card. I'm not saying he gave up being a man or sacrificed his masculinity as we understand it, as the
Mhm.
Romans understood it. They were
Right.
totally shaming him and humiliating him. We tend to focus a lot on the pain, the physical pain of the cross, because we're Westerners. But if you look at the language, it's like he despising the shame,
Hmm.
looking, to the author and finisher of our faith. He
Hmm.
despised the shame, the nakedness, the shame was the worst for him.
Hmm. And it's also interesting that it appears in the Gospels that the women were close at that, where
They
a
are
lot of
there.
the males fled, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the New Testament authors, and they do sort of privilege the women sometimes. They make them out to be the good guys and the disciples as bumbling idiots sometimes. And I don't think that is intended as a gender statement as much as a power statement that those who should know better, those with access, that's you and I with seminary training. Like those who should know better sometimes are the ones who are the worst at having blinded eyes to who God is. We fail to pray. We fail to like really apply all the things that we know. And you do see this starting immediately with here's Mary, a teenager. Is there any precedent for a virgin birth? Oh no, there is not. It's never happened. Okay, come over to like Elizabeth. Is there any precedent for an old couple? Old couple? You got a priest in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. He should have known better. Yes, there's precedent, Abraham and Sarah, etc., and
Right.
yet he doesn't believe. And we do see Luke juxtaposing those stories. And again, I don't think it's to throw men under the bus. It's those who should have known better, which in his context was the men.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so another thought I had, how do you see Jesus and the New Testament and the attitude towards women? Sometimes in our days, we it might be cast like it's a negative or that it's backwater, old, outdated views. Do you think that that's an accurate depiction of what we're?
No, I think what you see is somebody who would have really shocked people in his day. The disciples are wondering, why is Jesus even talking to a woman? The woman herself is like, I'm a Samaritan. What is happening here? So there are two cultural barriers there, and Jesus blows right through them. I mentioned the story earlier, the cultural barrier of somebody sitting in the physical stance of the being at the feet of a rabbi. That's pretty remarkable in his context. And I think the exact opposite. Now, there's a story of Jesus sparring with a Syrophoenician woman. And he's like, even the dogs, she says, even the dogs get crumbs.
Right.
And he compliments her faith and gives in. And
Hmm.
I don't think it's that we're supposed to read that as Jesus is a jerk to Gentiles, but she beats him in a conversation. I
Hmm.
think we're missing the smirk on his face and hers, and they're
Right.
sparring, and he lets her win the argument.
Hmm.
Well, I love that, right?
Yeah.
Love him. He's the best.
And knowing what to bring out of her or
Yeah, yeah.
within, he knows already inside
He
her.
does have the advantage of omniscience.
That
I'll
helps.
give
Yeah.
him that.
So would it be peculiar for him to have female disciples of that time with other rabbis in that era?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Act, Acts 8, Luke wrote it, Acts 8, 1 and 2, talks about these women that are traveling with Jesus and bankrolling Jesus. And we tend to think women didn't have any money in the time. Women were donors, they were, sponsors. You see that word used of Phoebe, who's a deacon. She has been a benefactor to me. And you would have women benefactors, and this is again a whole new area of study where we're finding it all over that it might not have been very common for women to inherit, but when they did, they would have some money. I think when we picture the women traveling with Jesus, we should picture widows because they probably come into their money because they didn't have a son and their husband died. Um, you do have the wife of Herod's steward, and so she had access to money. But what I'm getting at is I don't think these were 15 to 25-year-olds hanging out with Jesus. I think these are women who are older, losing some teeth.
Mm.
They're and they would have certainly not have shared sleeping space or anything like that. But it's not as weird as we might have thought it would be to have
Okay.
travelers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know because it is hard for us to know the context, or we bring so many assumptions that okay. Yeah, I think overall we mostly touched on the main topics. I could keep talking to you for a
I
while,
know I
but
could talk to you too, but for your listeners' sake, maybe we'll call it
yeah.
off, right?
But is there anything that I've missed or that I should have asked you regarding Nobody's Mother, your book, or is it
Nothing comes to mind except that just the emphasis, the exclamation point on that work is Jesus is superior. And sometimes women wonder, men and women wonder about women. Are they second class citizens? And does God call them? Yes. Does he give them a voice? Yes. He is Lord, he is God, he is better. And uh, everything that we read that makes it look like women are being diminished in the New Testament needs a context.
perfect? Yeah,
Thanks
that's
for having
really.
me. It's
Oh,
a great conversation.
thanks for speaking with me. Is there anywhere you'd like to direct anybody or
Now, the
what?
challenge here is to spell my last name correctly. So, Sandra Glahn, GLAHN.com. You can find all kinds of podcasts and videos and content. The other thing I would point to is there's a book where I was the general editor. It's a compilation of essays vindicating the vixens, which is relooking at some women wrongly vilified. And
Okay.
100% of the profits on that book go to the International Justice Mission to help
Okay.
fight human trafficking.
Okay, perfect.
So,
Yeah. So is there a good place for me to link that? Is Amazon
to my
still
website.
your
My
website?
website.
Oh,
Yep.
so should I
Yep.
just direct everything to your
That'd be
website? Is that what
great.
you would prefer?
Yep. That
Okay,
is.
so I will do that. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you.